Hello, leaders. Patrick Jinks here, leadership and strategy coach and president of the Jinks Perspective. We have our first guest today, and it's a very special one. Let's cue it up. Okay, last week we shared a collaborative blog post that a few of us in the coaching and consulting space authored to help nonprofit leaders like you think through this COVID-19 crisis by asking the right, sometimes tough questions that will keep us focused on the right things. One of those co-authors is Forrest Alton, founder and president of a consulting firm called 1,000 Feathers. He's here in my hometown of Columbia, South Carolina as well. I'll encourage you to visit 1000feathers.com for his full bio because it's impressive. But I can tell you that he learned his craft in the crucible of nonprofit executive leadership with stellar results over a couple of decades. He has lived what he teaches. Earlier this week, Forrest and I caught up via video conferencing to unpack a particular part of the blog post, and that's what I want to share with you here. We recorded our conversation on April 6th, 2020, so if you're coming across this video weeks, months, or even years after that, you'll understand our perspective at a point in time. With no further ado, let's get into our conversation with Forrest.
Forrest, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us. I don't know if you know this. I don't think I've told you this. Back in the beginning of my channel, I promised my audience, this is well over a year ago, that occasionally I would have guests on, and I've yet to do that. So you're the first one.
Oh, wow, what an honor. That's great.
So you're the first one. Thank you. And I also want to thank you for really being the kind of coordinator and convener of bringing some of us fellow coaches and consultants together to work on this blog piece that we did that our viewers have access to in the video description below each of the videos that we're doing. Thanks for pulling that together, and you and Casey did an awesome job on it. And one of the things that we've said for, I think all of us have said, we want to find ways to follow up, dig a little deeper into the content. And I wanted to just spend a few minutes with you today talking about the mission portion of that blog post. We covered, 5 different things that we thought nonprofit leaders ought to be focused on. And really, I think you were the one who kind of drove the conversation around mission and staying mission first in a time of crisis when we can so easily get distracted by all the stuff that's going on. So I'd like to... I think I'd like to start with what that means to reaffirm your mission right now. Nonprofits are always needing to reaffirm our mission,
Sure.
Think about it, and be sure that we're on it. But what is that? What are the implications right now? What does it look like in practice to reaffirm our missions in this time of COVID-19?
Yeah, it's a really good and important question. And just to back up a second, first of all, to say thanks for having me. I know that you'll be having some of the others as well that contributed to the blog that you referenced, and certainly being able to work with Casey and you and Charles and Tom. We recognized pretty early on that as consultants that work with a number of nonprofits, we were all having similar versions of these conversations, right? That so many people were struggling with similar things. And I think that piece really helped to articulate a number of those. One of which that I'm particularly passionate about, as you said, is, staying mission focused here, reaffirming your mission, if you will. I do think that's critically important. And not just your mission, but also your values, right? A lot of times those things travel together, but I think particularly important in this moment to be mindful of and make sure that everybody, your staff, your board, your stakeholders, know what those are. And that's not to say that we're doing, some quiz to make sure that everybody has them memorized word for word, but more importantly, that people understand the principle, right? Understand the core of who you are, of your mission, of your organizational values. I was thinking recently about an exercise that I completed pre-COVID-19 with an organization and their board, where we got the leadership team and the board in a room, and this organization happened to have 4 different value statements, and we put each of the value statements on a flip chart in a corner of the room. And we split up the board and the leadership team into small groups and gave them all markers and said, okay, let's start moving around the room, and we want you to write down what these values mean. What do they mean to you as a staff person, as a board member? And it was fascinating that, after a 90-minute or so activity, we did come to some consensus. But in the moment, even in what were pretty simple, straightforward words of value statements in this case, there was some real difference between how the board and the staff were interpreting those words and what it meant for the organization. I think that's the sort of activity that every organization could and probably should be doing right now. Is sure.
We take that for granted, don't we? Organizations have value statements, and it's in a time like this we go, oh yeah, what are our values? Kind of like continuity planning. Now is the time where we go, man, I wish we'd have had that continuity plan. Because your values have to show up now more than ever.
And not only do people need to know what they are, but need to know what they mean, right? And again, this is also true for your mission statement. I would guess there are plenty of organizations whose staff can repeat or recite the mission word for word because that's what they've been told they should be able to do. But if you really pressed and said, okay, but what does that mean? What does that mean in terms of how we serve the community? What does it mean in terms of how we act internally? What does it mean for us in a time of crisis? And we are in a crisis condition here. Those are the sort of questions I hope that organizations are asking. So this isn't just a sort of rogue, what is your mission question. It is, what does your mission really mean? And can you reaffirm what that means internally and externally?
That's so well said. I often tell my clients, I don't care so much if they know their mission statement as long as they know their mission.
Yeah, that's a really good way to summarize everything I just stumbled through, for sure.
No, that was so well said. It's what it made me think of. So the mission statement, obviously, when you do a strategic plan, the mission statement's front and center. What about the rest of the strategic plan? I'm sure you're working with, if you're like me, you're working with clients that either were in the middle of a strategic planning process when this started, or maybe they've just wrapped one up, or they're thinking about going into one. How would you suggest organizations reconcile a strategic, where they are in their strategic planning journey with this current situation?
Another really good question. And let's start with perhaps the obvious answer here, which is for those organizations that don't have an updated strategic plan, or maybe had just gotten started and were in the early days, now is a good time to put a pin in that, likely, right? Or not a good time, in other words, to start a robust strategic planning process. But there are also going to be organizations that are, most of the way through. We have a few clients in that case, or who just recently completed one. I sit on a board, and it happens to be a board that you helped with their strategic plan that is just recently finished and updated, and now are saying, what do we do about this? I think the first thing I would say, Patrick, is, we as consultants always say, or perhaps I should not put words in everybody's mouth. One of the things I always say is that your strategic plan is intended to be a fluid living document.
That's right.
We're about to test that theory, aren't we?
Yeah.
to make sure that talking point we go back to is accurate here. So if it is a fluid living document, then how do we use it to our advantage? How do we work with it? Another thing I often say to our clients is that the strategic planning process, is likely more important to your organization over the long term than the product, because it's encouraging us to push and think differently and inquire among our board and staff and stakeholders to help us, in many ways predict the future. The future just became incredibly more difficult to predict on balance here. But the strategic thinking process here shouldn't stop necessarily. Is it important to be looking at your plan? Of course, but probably more important to continue the strategic thinking that got you to the plan in the first place, and recognize it is a fluid document. In the blog, we use the terms step up, step in, step back.
Mm.
And when we wrote about those terms, we were writing about them, at least initially, at the organization level, the macro level, if you will. I would also suggest, to your question about what do we do with our strategic plan, that we use those three terms: step up, step back, step in, at the micro level with our strategic plan. We can be more granular here and look goal by goal, objective by objective. And there are
Mm.
some objectives or goals or strategies that we maybe should really step up. We should accelerate. We should be doing more of, because they're critical. The fierce urgency of now, if you will, right? Now is the time to get these done. There
Mm.
might be other strategies where we really need to step back. Maybe some things in that plan are less pressing or less relevant. I think we need to own that, right? And then even within our organization, what I also hope is that across our organizations, within our organizations, we can find places to step in. That is, team members or members of the management team. Maybe the objective they were responsible for isn't as relevant, but their neighbor across the hall has some pressing needs. That's where,
Mm.
as team members, we can step in, right? So I was struck, reflecting back on the blog, we use these terms: step up, step in, step back, at the organization level. I think the more thought I put into it, though, I'd also encourage agencies and organizations to be using them at the micro strategic plan level. What are the
That
strategies where we step up, step in, and step back?
that is so good. That's a perfect use of that model to help organizations look at their strategic plan. I just think if they look at it with those three questions, where are those places? I think that's a perfect thing. Let me ask you one more question, Forrest. I think we're
Sure.
all asking this one. There's a lot of organizations asking right now, how do we survive this long-term viability? How do we come out and stay afloat? And they're thinking about layoffs and funding and all these things, like a lot of businesses are. There's a lot of organizations on the front lines right now, working in the trenches with vulnerable populations as a part of their mission. And they're not only asking, how do we survive? They're asking, how do we serve right now? Like, this is our moment to really show how relevant we are and how impactful and needed we are. Just kind of, what's your thought on how nonprofits deal with those two questions at the same time? How do we survive and how do we thrive right now?
Well, first of all, you framed the question in exactly the right way, because the answer is how, or the question you asked is, how do we ask both of those questions simultaneously? And I would say that the answer is the question, right? Make sure that as organizations, we are asking both of these questions simultaneously. I used to run a nonprofit for a number of years, and I get it, right? Our blink reaction, especially at the executive and leadership level in moments like these, is to enter survival mode, right? And how do we keep the organization afloat? I get it. I understand that question is important, but I am also challenging every organization I talk to be sure we're asking the question, how do we continue to serve, right? And again, not prioritizing one question over the other, but making sure that this is a both and scenario, that we're asking both of those questions. By definition, as nonprofit organizations, we are here to serve, to provide a service. And obviously our ability to survive is inextricably linked to our ability to serve long term. I think that organizations who are only asking one of those questions in the moment, and that is, how do we survive, those are going to be the organizations that in fact have trouble surviving. My prediction is those organizations that are really thoughtful and clear about how do we continue serving, especially the populations we might be serving that in the moment need us now the most. The organizations that can really push themselves and ask that question, how do we continue serving? The byproduct of that will be survival, right? And so I just really do hope that organizations are being thoughtful and asking both of those questions. By the way, this ties directly back to this, reaffirming your mission, right? And understanding who you are, and understanding how do we live out our mission? How do we live out our values? And it also ties directly back to those values. We're seeing some exceptional creativity from organizations who are taking events online, right? You're seeing a live stream from the zoo or virtual arts classes or those sort of things, where organizations have really leaned into their mission and values and said, how do we continue delivering this core service, even if it doesn't seem an essential service in the moment? And of course, this conversation is much, much different for the organizations that are working with the homeless or the food banks or the
Right.
Goodwills of the world or the Red Crosses of the world, who do have, in fact, a very critical mission and a crisis specific mission here in the moment. But for every organization, I think we're doing a real disservice to our stakeholders and to our donors if the only question we're asking is how do we survive. And my experience, Patrick, is that donors have a pretty long memory about this sort of thing. And if donors see us now really asking the question, how do we serve? And yes, by the way, we may need some financial help to be continuing to serve, that donors will be much more responsive to that sort of request than a donation request that's solely tied to survival of our organization.
Yeah, well said. I mean, that's the value add that we're going to be communicating a year from now and 5 years from now to remind our donors, we were there thanks to you.
Exactly. It's another thing we said on the blog, right? To balance this short-term and long-term decision making. And this is a perfect example of that, right? The blink reaction in the short term may be to say, we need money right now to keep our doors open. But the long play here is, we might need money right now to continue serving those who are most in need. And you can even hear in those statements how the perception and the reality is different for your stakeholders, but also for your staff, quite frankly, to keep them motivated to do their jobs and live out our mission.
Man, good stuff. Need to have you on more. Hey,
I love that we've gotten to work together on this blog and otherwise. There's lots more of these conversations coming. I can feel it.
Yeah, I think so too, and I think it's great that you and I, and sort of a triangulating circle of a number of other people in our space trying to serve nonprofits from our lens, have had conversations about working together. This has brought it out of us, and I think it's bringing out togetherness and collaboration for all of us, but it certainly has done it here, and I'm thrilled about it. Is there anything else, any sort of parting message or perspective you'd like to share with our nonprofit leaders that my questions didn't give you a chance to say?
I'm just really thankful for the opportunity, Patrick. Thanks for lending this platform, and I know you'll be having some other guests in the near future. I do think the one thing that's important to remember in closing is that, as we're all sitting around sort of opining on this, the fact is these conversations are going to look different for every organization, right? And so we've been pretty cautious and conscious in all of our writing and speaking to not say this is the one thing you should do.
Right.
And I hope that I've done that here in the last few minutes, and instead saying, here are some of the questions you should be asking yourself. And I think if we can push out the difficult questions, the right questions, and all challenge ourselves to be as creative and thoughtful as we can in this moment, that's the path forward, right? It's not searching for the one right answer or the one silver bullet that's going to save every organization, because this conversation looks different across the nonprofit community. But the key in my mind is a commitment to asking the difficult questions and getting all of our thinkers, our staff, our board, and otherwise around the table to try to answer them together.
Man, you speak in my language. I'm not smart enough to have the answers, so I've learned how to make my living asking the questions and relying on the smart people. And man, we got some talented, intelligent, incredible people in this sector. I've got a lot of faith in what they're doing. And so thanks again, Forrest. Really appreciate it. Look forward to working more and hearing more from you, and stay safe.
Happy to do it. You too, Patrick. Thank you.
That's the Jinx perspective for now, combined with the Alton perspective. I hope you'll check out 1000 Feathers at the link that we've left in the video description below. Next week, Forrest's colleague at 1000 Feathers, Casey Banks, will join us to talk about the critical nature of communication in times of crisis. As always, if you'd like to explore ways that the Jinx perspective can help you and your organization achieve greater clarity, simplicity, and alignment in your mission work, reach out and schedule a free discovery call by clicking the link that's also in the video description below. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to this YouTube channel by clicking the subscribe button below. Click the bell icon to notify you when we drop new episodes. See you here next week.